Hello and welcome to Perennial Podcast episode 8. I'm here again with Ken, and I did have a debate with Jay Dyer last night. Hopefully some of you were able to catch it. There are a lot of interesting things said there, and foremost in my mind is kind of the regret of not being able to assert more positive content. There was sort of a steamroller effect going on where I would start making a point and then it would be interrupted and it would kind of get sidetracked from the issues that I wanted to initially address. But how are you doing, Ken? And what do you think of that debate last night?
I'm doing good. I was interested by a lot of aspects of it. I'm not too familiar with Jay Dyer. I know he did a thing with Worski. That's when he first came to my attention. But other than that, he seems pretty religiously focused. Reminds me of kind of Andy Nowicki in a way, in that he's really into the conspiratorial stuff, esoteric Hollywood, reading into that symbolism, but opposed to the symbolism. Yeah, I watched the debate. I was interested in a lot of the peripheral stuff because it was at some point like you would try to state a premise and he had a problem with that axiom. And so you were unable to unfold the premise basically. But yeah, it was some of the stuff I was interested in was he seems so, I mean, from my point of view, like from a perennialist big picture point of view, like a historical view, it seems sort of myopic the way he would, when he talked about the true writers, the people who had best approximated the truth, he would always go back to these monks or these priests between, it seemed approximately like the 4th century and the 11th century or something. And all these people lived a very specific lifestyle, very specific ascetic lifestyle. And so if he's so focused on their argumentation, the way that they present metaphysics as, this absolute truth revealed from scripture, then is he living that way? I don't know his personal life. Just from the outside, it looks like he immerses himself in Hollywood, analyzing that, breaking it down, deconstructing it, which I don't think is bad or makes him a bad person. I just look at him in his presentation on YouTube as kind of a modern man, or maybe even a postmodern man, and I don't see like if he were to meet all these authors that he very much admires, would there be a conflict of praxis between them? And from my perspective, it's like the way that you live your life and your praxis is very deeply meshed with your ideas and your intellectuality and your argumentation and your biases. The way that you view the world is the way that you do the world. So is he doing the world in the way that he's reading these people? And my opinion is like no one could view the world in the way that they viewed it because no one's quite doing the world. Maybe, I don't know, Brother Nathaniel or someone living off in the mountains or something, but I don't think he is living off in the mountains. If he is, I mean, he can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think those are intertwined. I think there's a positive feedback loop between them. And so that's like my first questioning of the whole context of that debate. If he's so into this specific historical period, this specific historical context, and he has kind of a supremacist view of that, to use the word loosely, is he actually, his praxis, is it fitting within that context?
Which is one of the reasons that draws me towards a monistic worldview, because all aspects of our conception, our conduct are integrated by the commonality of being properties of the self, of our experience. And so you really can't isolate ethics from metaphysics. And, I don't think that Jay does conceptually, but there are definitely arbitrary steps that come from the fact of a fiat, an orthodox fiat coming from a central organization that lays down an ethical prescription, but I don't see it following naturally from the metaphysical presupposition. So basically, my contention, and I wasn't able to hone in on this as much as I would have liked. My contention with the position is that it is compartmentalized, and one part doesn't logically imply another. You kind of just have to buy it all as a set. And yeah, that is a good point, that he does not seem to live in accordance with the praxis of the authors that he recommends. Like he does spend all this time immersed in the postmodern globalist culture. Now, it's in order to expose it, which is laudable, and so I can see justifications for that. But other things, like he makes jokes about lewd things, and I guess that's not unacceptable in the Orthodox worldview. But there are some seeming inconsistencies. But I think everybody is hypocritical to some extent, so I don't really fault him for it too seriously. So that's for what happened last night, and I did mirror it. So if you don't know how to find Jay's channel, they'll just search Jay Dyer, Jdyer, and I'm sure it'll come up right away. But I mirrored it on mine, and we had in mind today to talk about, and this is Ken's topic as usual, identitarianism as the enemy of idealism. So what do you mean by that, Ken?
Okay, so it's an idea that you can take in multiple ways. Identitarianism is basically this in-group preference. It's putting your group before others. And on the smallest scale, it's selfishness, it's narcissism, it's putting the group known as the individual, and that's how I view an individual, as a grouping of cells and so on, the group of the individual first before others. We know the consequences of selfishness. We know that it leads to unethical behavior in terms of people stealing and murdering and harming their neighbors. And you can't really build a society built on pure selfishness, despite what, Ayn Rand or objectivists would have you think. You need some degree of altruism. Otherwise, you would have to have a Platonic, republic where everyone has a watchman watching over them to prevent them from unethical behavior, because that's the only way you can provide those positive and negative incentives. Now, you could theorize that in the future with technology, we really could have these artificial watchmen watching over us, and perhaps that is why altruism is drifting out of favor and preference for a more self-based culture. But that's a little bit far into transhumanism. The smallest unit of selfishness, that identitarianism, we see the flaws with it. We see how it contradicts idealism of self-sacrifice, of something higher than yourself, higher morality, low time preference behavior, basically, collectivization, art, and so on. And so then beyond
idealism, that, just to clarify here, by idealism, you're referring to kind of being idealistic and oriented towards like lofty ideals rather than like philosophical idealism. Although there is some connection.
Yeah, and right, and the word idealism as a word, it can mean a school of philosophy, it can mean just being idealistic, but then also in terms of just superficial political things like, should we have tax cuts or should we raise taxes? If you're focused always on your personal group, in politics, the way that you're voting is group-based rather than policy-based. So you're voting for a party because that's your party as part of your identity group. And this is the criticism that conservatives have, these colorblind conservatives. They say, we need to let go of racism because racism is preventing Black people from voting conservative. It's preventing, I don't know what other groups, Hispanics from voting conservative. So we need to get rid of identity politics so we can just focus on the issues. And I think that's kind of like a superficial analogy for the way that identitarianism contradicts idealism, focusing on the ideas. Let's just talk about the political ideas. Why do we bring race into it? Why is it that if we talk about tax cuts, why are Black people going to say something like, I'm not even going to listen to you because you're racist or something? And conservatives get frustrated. They say, we need to let go of race and we need to all just become one people, and then we can focus on the ideas rather than on these superficial identities. And you can take this to, other examples of ethnic groups when you compare them to whites. If whites, we're going to make the presupposition that whites are the most universalistic group, that they have the least identitarian attitude of all, ethnic groups in the world, then we would expect that whites would be most focused on ideals and morality, things like, conservationism, things like, animal rights, things like, bringing all kinds of people into their country, being very open to third world immigration and so on. So they're able to have this idea of self-sacrifice, don't be nepotistic, don't have a preference for the in group, just look at the ideas in themselves. We don't care if our grandchildren look like us as long as we have the Constitution. That is a idea of conservatives that is kind of foreign to pretty much everyone else everywhere in the world. So the alt-right criticizes this idea of idealism put above identitarianism because they see it as destructive. Like they say, first you need your identity, and from there you have your ideals. If you only have idealism, then you're going to destroy your identity. And they see like idealism as coming from identity rather than the other way around. So there's this conflict between identitarianism and idealism, and it's a problem, I think, either way. When you go the conservative route, which is to say that everyone needs to disarm their identities, I think that's unrealistic. But then on the other hand, when you have people who are saying that we need to basically, the way that they'll phrase it is something like, we need to be like Jews and we need to just give up, like all morality is contingent upon the in-group, which is a lot of the way that it, like Talmudic thinking and Talmudic law works, is the foundation of law is the preservation of the in-group, and like all idealism is subject to that and subject to change around that locus. So with if white people were to change their orientation away from idealism toward identitarianism, then they would, in a sense, they would be really a different kind of a people, radically different from how they are now. So it's a very interesting contradiction where if you like whiteness and you like white civilization, then if you're saying we need to, in order to save white civilization, we need to like sacrifice our idealism in order to get back to identitarianism, then in a sense you're saying, I like white people so much that I want to change the nature of white people. Which, I mean, from an evolutionary point of view, that's not necessarily unjustified, but it is something that, when we think about white people generally, we have to understand that if you want to talk about white identitarianism, you are in contradiction with the core of whiteness itself, essentially. And so that is what you are at battle with. And if you don't address that, you're not really going to be able to change a lot of people's minds, except those who are already biased in your favor on a psychological level.
Yeah. So white idealism is essential to white identity, which kind of creates a number of conundrums for the advocate of Western people. Now, Mr. Coolmug kind of disagrees with this. He says, I don't believe Europeans are the most universalistic in their thinking. I don't think any group is. I think the argument from innate characteristics is unconvincing. So if it's possible to be more or less universalistic in thought, then some group should result in more or less universalistic thinking than another. And if we just look at the evidence, the historical tradition, the West did develop this detached scientific approach that wasn't embedded ultimately in the cultural contextual ideas or the Volksgedanken or whatever. They were more interested in cutting through that, and we did inspire more revolutions in thought in the Western literary tradition. I don't know if we can say that it's a genetic basis, but it definitely has been a factor of how we form our identity. So there's a couple points on this that I do want to hit. One is that a fulfillment of idealism necessitates unity of identity to some extent, because if you don't have that unitary identity and you're not all part of a common culture, like think about the university culture in Europe in the Middle Ages. People traveled between different European countries. The literate classes were cosmopolitan at that time. And that created this common identity where this very highly idealistic philosophy was allowed to flow forward. Because if you don't reach this consensus identity and common praxis, then a coherent idealistic structure is not likely to be built. So these are at odds, but they also seem to mutually support one another. So in addition to idealism depending on identity to some extent, it seems that identity depends on idealism, in that we have to construct preferences for how we propagate ourselves, and that involves idealistic choices and sentiments. And so because we have certain ideals, we select ourselves into the next generation in particular ways. Now, there's another comment from Cool Mug. How do you measure for more universalistic thinking without taking into account historic and cultural and spiritual influences? For me, it's plainly a matter of changing minds. I'm not getting a hard point there that I can grab onto. But when I say more universalistic thinking, I'm saying less particular thinking. So a thought structure can be devoid of particular empirical contents, and it can be highly abstract and therefore applicable to a large variety of actual contexts, or it can be embedded in a given case. So like when I think of, I can have the universal idea of a flower, which it's arguable whether or not we can actually call that to mind in terms of the imagination, but obviously the fact that the semiotic structure is there indicates that it is something coherent to talk about this universal of the flower, as opposed to me picturing a sunflower in a particular field that I've seen. So that is more particular thinking. And so how do you measure for more universal thinking? I would say if someone writes something that applies to a broader number of scenarios, then this is an indication that it's more universalistic. If it only applies to a given time and place and context, then it's particular. So like math is extremely universal, and it has been primarily Western peoples who have developed mathematics, although Indians were also influential, and Arabs at a certain point in time.
Well, I would also say that if you go back 800 years to the golden age of mathematics in these places, you also had a much more racially stratified society, and that's borne out by population genetics. But as far as universalism in language, one of the things I wanted to briefly just introduce was like the Chinese language, for instance. The Chinese language is very particular. If you ever study Chinese, it's a tonal language, meaning that like shu, shu, and all these things that we use to indicate questions, emotions, and subtleties of our psychology, they actually put that as a signifier of meaning. And so it's extremely particular, and it's extremely difficult to learn Chinese, even for Chinese people to become literate, because you have to memorize each word, and each word has no logical connection to one another. Whereas Western languages, Indo-European languages, are extremely focused on almost like a universal axiomatic system that we then derive words from by changing grammatical endings, slight variations on a theme, so that you can see the relation of complex structures down to their simplest morphemes, basically. So I would say that on a linguistic level, and you could just put it in a Chomskyite, environmentalist or nurture perspective, but you would at least look at the language and say, we have one set of languages over here, for example, just comparing these two civilizations, where it's based in its orientation on simple fundamentals, simple axiomatic morphemes, which then evolve into complex superstructures with grammar and everything else that's involved there. Whereas you look at something like Chinese, and each individual word is radically separate from one another, has no logical connection to one another. You make a slight change in the tone, not even the sound, but the tone, and you radically change the meaning so that there's no interconnectedness to it. There's no like logic to it. It's just brute force memorization. So I think when we talk about particularism versus a universalism, that this is a great example of a way that kind of thinking is contained within cultures and civilizations.
Yeah. It's often said that Chinese discourse tends to be circumlocutive. It tends to kind of orbit around a central theme that can't quite be explicitly stated in the way that a grammatical system which uses like declension, conjugation, and the kinds of like place assigning. There's a particular term that I'm looking for, the kind of language where the end of the term usually shifts depending on its grammatical function. From linguistics, there's a term that describes that kind. But anyway, Indo-European languages,
different case: nominative, accusative, genitive, ablative, vocative.
Right. But there's a general term for grammars that are like that. But anyway, Indo-European is like that. So on the topic of Indo-Europeans, Mr. Coolmug, I suppose my question would be, is pathological altruism something innate to whites or something that we're taught? Now, the altruism of Western civilization has roots in the Indo-European practice of hospitality to guests. And from how we can reconstruct the language, from the existing myths, it's very clear that there was formal etiquette for accepting strangers. And there are myths in the Greek mythology of like the gods appearing to you as a stranger, asking for like, a bed for the night and a meal or something like that. And you are supposed to just accept people into your house. So this altruism has a mythological basis. It has a legal basis in the norms and customs that were established seemingly under the Yamna culture, again, 3200 BC. It's also present in Scandinavian mythology. It's in the Prose Eddas. There's one part of the Prose Edda in particular, I think it starts with an H, like the Hamadal or something like that I thought like the ethos there agrees very closely with my personal intuitive morality. And it just makes sense that in that kind of climate, if you don't, as a society, set up this principle that we are going to care for strangers, a lot of travelers will simply end up dying. So in order for you to avoid that potentiality, it's like this Kantian doctrine where everyone acts according to the maxim that they themselves would like to experience, a variation of the golden rule. And other cultures often have this. It's not like this is unique to Indo-European cultures. Hospitality is definitely a part of Arab culture and has been for a long time. It's part of African culture, but not in an intertribal way to such an extent in African culture. I don't know about hospitality very much at all from the Chinese history that I'm familiar with. So it does seem like different cultures emphasize this guest hospitality ethos to differing degrees, and there's an evolutionary advantage to it, which means that we did evolve to conform to this ethos because it had a competitive advantage. So it's like it's taught, but anything that's taught over many generations is going to have some sort of genetic implication. And I'm just going to go through more chat. So he does say it's mostly taught, but I don't know. That's kind of just a vague general statement. Mr. Coolmug, poor thinking is a better answer. If you think about it long enough, no one could ever suggest that mass immigration is the Christian thing to support.
Yeah, under certain axioms, sure. It depends on how you define Christianity. I mean, look, if it were the case, for instance, that let's use the robotic example, transhumanism, because I almost touched on it. If we had some future where there's some artificial intelligence that we were going to create, which was going to replace us, and we knew it was going to be better than us in every way, it was going to have emotions, it was going to have some concept of a soul, it was going to have better intelligence, better empathy, better altruism, better ethics and morality. And their question was, should we bring this into existence knowing that it will ultimately replace us? Or should we, shirk back and try to preserve ourselves like, dinosaurs trying to prevent the mammals from overtaking them? And so, I think there is some conception of like this loyalty to a higher power above oneself that is within Christianity, where you say, and this is the basic ethos of the celibate priest, that he's not trying to propagate his own genetic material. He's actually sacrificing his ability to do so in order to help everybody else. So I think the basic orientation of a priest is to say, yes, in a sense, I do want to be genetically replaced by all the people around me. And so it is a very priestly thing to let refugees into your country from that perspective. Now, of course, there are implications in terms of if you're letting in a people who, by their orientation, are very selfish. It is not a truly selfless act to let in selfish people. But if you come from this blank slate perspective of everything is just taught, altruism is taught, nothing is innate, then you would believe that, well, we can just teach these people to be exactly like ourselves and there won't be any difference. So, I think there is a good Christian justification for mass immigration if, you don't understand hereditarianism, or you don't even believe in some kind of cultural hereditarianism, where simply just people, even if genes don't matter at all, people still stick to their roots. People still stick to what their parents taught them. They still form identities around things like physiognomy and physical appearance, and they group together with people who simply look like them and form, local cultures in that way. You can see this with white people. People dress up like goths. People dress up as jocks. People dress up in a certain way. They group together at the lunch table, and they form their own little cultural ethos around a manner of appearance. So, if that can happen within white culture, then certainly it can happen with these different races, even if you don't want to believe in a genetic explanation. So, yeah, it is. I don't think, and especially with the debate we had last night of people want to define Christianity as this thing where you have to support mass immigration, and then other people will say, well, it's completely impossible to interpret it that way. Well, you have two people looking at the same tradition or looking at the same scripture and coming up with like radically different perspectives. Just de facto empirically, you cannot say that, oh, it's impossible to derive this from that, because this has been derived from that. So now, from my perspective, it's like you need some kind of synthesis where you say people have, from Christianity, they have produced a tradition which has been subverted in this way. Now, how do we take that tradition and move on a subversion of subversion into evolution, into the next step of how do we take that tradition, evolve it into something new that accounts for this recent error? And that would be, you have to go in line with that. You can't just totally destroy it and build something from the ground up. So yeah, I'm still thinking about that debate and how it brought to mind a lot of the old Christian versus atheist debates, or creationist versus atheist. And there was a part of me that just wanted to be like, what is if you're asking about the foundations of perennialism, what are the foundations of Christianity? And for me, it is an evolving tradition that had a history before itself, has to have a history after itself, but those things must be connected and not in complete opposition to one another. Uh, that's just big picture thoughts about the Christian and immigration debate.
Right. Now, Mr. Cool Mug, mass immigration is destructive to our society, to our identity, to our culture, to our sense of belonging, to our economy, to our working classes. Why would Christ support that? Well, this is the basic theme of this episode, idealism versus identity. So if you don't care about your own identity, if you, carry your cross, if you die to yourself and follow in Christ's path, then who cares if it's worse for you if it means helping all these others? Now, I don't actually think that is for the best for anyone. Now, but I don't think that you can derive it simply from the Christian tradition that's come down to us. So this, just like in pure philosophical terms, the maxim that you'd be operating under with mass immigration is, if you have open borders, people gravitate towards wealthier societies. So that's one premise. The other premise is wealthy societies are created by genetic value and cultural value, right? So, I mean, the natural implication doesn't matter that it's white. It could be any hypothetical culture. But wealth is produced by genetic and cultural value, which takes time to develop in a selective process, and mass immigration obviously swamps that and gets rid of it. So just as a planet, in terms of the development of the entire species, if you accept mass immigration, over time we're going to not develop as highly as if those cultures that got certain things right were allowed to propagate their genes instead of being replaced. Like, clearly, the cutting edge of the species, the most adaptive members of the species, should be allowed to reproduce more instead of being genetically replaced. And so that's, again, going back to this kind of Kantian maxim there, where you act according to the maxim that you would have universalized. So it's not a matter of what I sentimentally take to be an idealist kind of act, where this is where Christian altruism typically comes from. Like, oh, I feel good when I give $20 to the homeless guy. Well, like, guess what? That homeless guy is probably going to go buy some heroin, and maybe he's going to overdose. So maybe you just killed him, but you feel good about it. Like, we don't know always the full extent of our action, which puts the impetus on us to acquire full accounting and have a means of like universalizing or like operationalizing our ethical prescriptions and seeing how they have implications for the broader world. And that, yeah, so I did want to talk about the philosophical idealism versus identity issue, because it's kind of apropos to this a little bit. So philosophical idealism, that the idea that there's nothing really material, the world is experience, essentially, the world is mind. That is characteristic of perennialist traditions, and the ethical prescription there is asceticism, is letting go of attachment, of letting go to the structure that we build up as the self. And I think that this is just at face value obvious, that people do build up a structure as themselves, because we have like revolutions in our own personality and we redefine ourselves. So clearly the self, as it actually like appears to us phenomenologically, is mutable. And so by drawing down away from those mutable qualities down to the real essence of things, we're recognizing reality for what it is. And that is a process of undoing the constructed identity. But I don't view this as a hard dichotomy. So this is like the deepest level metaphysical implication of the idealism identity debate or dispute. They seem to be at odds in a certain respect, but they always depend on each other. Because what you're really looking at when you're looking at identity, identity in its fullest sense subsumes all idealistic aspects. The idealistic structure can be seen as a narrative or a description of the identity. The identity is the real structure. Idealism is a method of expounding on that, and vice versa. So the real what is the identity essentially? Well, informational reductionism, idealism, it reduces to these forms, and reality is language in that sense. So that's just at the strictly metaphysical level. Now let's get back into the chat, and then I kind of wanted to go back to this issue of mass immigration because I think there is a lot there with viewing it through this lens of idealism versus identity. So. Yeah, Mr. Cool Mug, it isn't helping them by bringing them here. Yeah, usually they end up dependent on welfare. Now, it all depends on what they ultimately value. If what they value by coming here is opportunity to bed white women, then maybe they do see themselves as coming off better. And I think a large proportion of them, that is what they want. So, spiritually, are they helping themselves? Probably not, because in my view, in a male-female relationship, the male should be more developed spiritually. They should be more intelligent. They should be able to guide the female, because this is what satisfies men. This is psychologically what men desire. They want to be that protector. They want to be the rock that the wife depends on. And if you you don't want to marry someone that's 15 or 20 IQ points above you as a wife, and that's going to be the case more often than not in these non-white couplings. Not absolutely every time, but just statistically, that's the way it has to work out. And in that sense, spiritually, I don't think it's helping the men. I think they're having a desire fulfilled, but it's definitely arguable whether that's actually in the long run best for the state of their soul. Then Mr. Cool Mug again, there is a difference between doing good and wanting to be seen to be doing good. Yeah, I kind of spoke to that a little bit, or feeling like you're doing good and really providing that full accounting and looking at the more far-reaching implications of your acts, and then concluding that yes, this is actually something that if everyone abided by this would be better for all of us. And of course, not at all, I'm back to Mr. Cool Mug, and of course, not all seemingly good actions are truly good. It takes thinking more and moral intuition to know good. Yeah, this is something that bothered me when I was very young. I've always, as long as I can remember, had this highest ideal of pursuing truth. And what bothered me was when people in my life, like even my mother, she valued love and getting along, basically. And the highest ideal did seem to be love. But if you don't, in my household, but if you don't set the truth as the highest ideal, how can you be sure that valuing love ends up with all of us being better off? You really don't know that. And so many people become, foaming at the mouth, defending their position morally, and they haven't done the due diligence. In essence, the conclusion that I came to when I was young was that the most moral action is dedicating yourself wholeheartedly to the pursuit of truth. Because if you could have pursued more truth and gotten things more right, then you would be acting under more truthful ethical prescriptions. And so, by not dedicating time to figuring things out, figuring out the true nature of things, you're incurring this huge moral hazard. No matter how certain you are in your own position, because you didn't dedicate yourself in earnest to pursuing the truth, you are more likely to be wrong, and you're more likely to hurt people as a result. So, and I really didn't like the way that intellectualism in the working class is often looked down on as a moral stain. oh, that he doesn't care about people, he just reads books, or he thinks he's better than us. Like there are definitely negative sentiments directed towards the intellectual type among the working classes, and I think it's obviously not moral.
Mm.
All right. So, what are your thoughts, Ken?
Yeah, basically and it was interesting. I took some notes on the J Dare thing, which I'm going to keep referring back to. And at one point, he was talking about the many versus the one, and like he was basically saying that perennialism, everything has to be one. You're denying the manyness of stuff, but really the two exist simultaneously. And I look at it like the one is the feminine. The one is what brings us together. The one is the coalescence of the group around some group identity. That is the particularism. That is the tribalism. And then the many, that the differentiation, that cutting, the Apollonian individualism of breaking things down to their components, that's the masculine. And so, yeah, there is the many in the one. And I mean, if I was talking to JJ, I'd be like, yeah, there's no problem with that.
Right.
And that's how it basically pans out with men and women, in that women are thinking first and foremost of their children. And if they have to do something unethical for the benefit of their children, I think that their ethics or their moral intuition is more built around the success of their children, the survival of their children. Whereas men, I mean, if you look at historically in terms of mythology and even in terms of real life events, where there were Romans, and I wish I remembered the names, but Romans who occasionally fathers had to fight their sons because the sons were like leading an uprising or doing something against Roman law. And they said, my first allegiance is to Roman law, and I actually have to kill my sons as traitors to Rome because that serves my highest ideal. But can you imagine a woman who's like, my son broke the law, so now I'm going to kill him?
If anyone wants to read a very particular case of that is the subject at hand in Euthyphro, like the Euthyphro dilemma people talk about. Mm-hmm. Are things good because God wants them to be good, or are they good? And that philosophical dilemma comes from the Platonic dialogue of Euthyphro, and the character of Euthyphro is doing exactly that, except with his father. He's trying to take his father to court because he violated the law, and he's trying to make exactly that argument. So just giving a reference for that concept.
Yeah, I mean, it comes up plenty of times. I mean, Abraham and Isaac. Abraham is supposed to kill his son to serve, the law of God, basically. And people can look at that and say it's horrific. Although I don't think, again, within the context of identitarianism versus idealism, I don't know if the basic moral of that mythos has really been carried on in the way that we would think about it on the surface level. But I mean, it's everywhere. And when, for instance, you have a lot of popular stories in America about young black men being shot by cops or young black men getting in trouble with the law. And the mother is always out there in front of the cameras saying that my son is a good guy. He did not do anything wrong. And it's completely devoid of the empirical truth. Right. The fact that her son did nothing wrong is fundamental. It's fundamentally based on the axiom that he is her son, and therefore he did nothing wrong in her eyes because she has this like perfect love for him. Yeah. And so the actual truth of the matter of, no, he did something wrong, and he actually, by ethics, should be punished by society. That's like a masculine concept, basically.
The good is defined. I do think the good is defined by those people as being a participation in your shared identity. And I noticed this very strongly also in basic training, and that was the first time in my life I really dealt with blacks. And the group of blacks in basic training, they're a minority of maybe 5% of everybody, and I didn't understand that they had this ethos that all of them agreed to, that you never rat someone out. Basically, you never report crime. And that's very common in black communities. Whereas for white people, it's like, even if I have this bond of identity or allegiance with the individual, like, the law must be upheld, the universal must be upheld, because we have this idea, like, it's the good is not defined by participation in a shared identity. It's defined by something above us. And so, yeah, in that sense, we do seem to be more universalistic. But I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, that's fine. You want to like reference pop culture. Breaking Bad is an interesting example of that kind of dilemma in the modern day, where you have a guy who's breaking the law for the sake of his family. Although in the end he says it was just for himself. It's a little bit complicated, but that's the basic premise: is he's breaking the law to help his family. Now the people around him, his family, are faced with the dilemma ultimately where they have to say, do I stay loyal to this man, returning the loyalty he's had for me, or do I have this higher standard of the law is the law, ethical behavior is ethical behavior, and it is divorced from these particular relationships, and so I have to apply it even where it contradicts with these particular relationships, and different characters make different choices. And as it happens, his wife ultimately chooses him. She chooses the particular relationship, whereas his brother-in-law, who is like this cop basically, he is adherent to the law. So even though he loves this man, the moment he realizes that Walter White is a criminal, he's like, no, the law must be upheld. And he instantly goes from loving him to hating him within like a matter of minutes. Like it's a very quick, decisive, emotional turn where he has no doubts, no second thoughts. He's not like, I love you, but I have to do this for the law. It's like, no, you're a scumbag, you're a criminal. Right. This radical, he's radically divorced from that particular relationship. The love and empathy that he had, it totally dissipates in an instant, and he goes full on authoritarian. We have to enforce morality here. So, I mean, that is a perfect example of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that instinct is a means of shifting a failure to live up to an idealistic framework onto an immediately perceived identity in the person. And so this is like the moral stain, and the idea that when you do something wrong, there really is something about your person that's transformed, and we feel very differently about people like that. But that sentiment is not as strong in all, or equally strong in all groups, it does seem. So probably in the black community, if you commit crime, well, they have very different conception of crime anyway. Like, their folk justice, like being a drug dealer is generally not seen as bad. So, whereas it depends on if you're in a church community and someone finds out that, you cheated on your wife, or even like you divorced your ex-wife or something like that, then people really, their sense of your identity will be fundamentally different. It's not just this kind of like, you're not living up to our abstract ideals, you're not living up to this law, therefore I have to dissociate from you. It's really brought to a visceral, emotional, intuitive level, and we perceive that like your identity is compromised.
Yeah, in that situation, the ideals construct the identity. You are who you are because you follow the law. And if you don't follow the law, then you're a different person. Versus the thing where you are who you are, and like whether or not you follow the law is like, that's just something that comes out of you, but you still are the same person. And that's like when someone commits a crime, like a 17-year-old black 6'4" football player commits an assault, and then they show pictures of him as a 14-year-old, like looking very cute and innocent. There's this implication there that he is simultaneously the 6'4" football player and the young little cute 14-year-old at the same time. He is who he is, and his the moral actions of being a cute 14-year-old and being innocent, that just springs from himself, and also the assault springs from himself, but he still is himself, worthy of love for his good and his bad aspects. Whereas the idealistic point of view is his actions actually change his identity, who he is. So he is no longer that 14-year-old. He is now the 17-year-old. He has gone down a bad path. We are now divorced from that childlike, innocent image of him. And I kind of lost my train of thought there on Harvey Weinstein, great example of a lot of people who have come out to not defend necessarily Harvey Weinstein, because he's kind of been a scapegoat for the whole Me Too movement, but there have been a lot of people who have been accused of sexual abuse of women, who people have come out and said, look, normally I'm a feminist, normally I would be against this sort of thing, but we have to give this guy a second chance because this is starting to look like an anti-Semitic pogrom here. We need to be very careful. Anytime you attack a member of the Jewish community, no matter how bad or obvious the crime is, there's always this implication of, hey, this is kind of getting anti-Semitic here. So there's definitely this group idea of, they've committed a crime. We might not like it. We might disagree with it, but they're a part of our group. And anytime anyone attacks a black person, the black community instinctively feels this defensive urge. The same with the Jewish community. And with white people, I mean, if a white person is on trial for something, a white person has done something bad, white people don't say, oh, are you attacking the white community? They say, no, he's a criminal. He's separate from the white community. So the concept of whiteness is really founded on morality. If you do something wrong, you are kind of cast out of the white community. And even though people won't admit that there really is a white community, I think there is something of a white community, and people are cast out of it. And whereas in the black community and the Jewish community, if you do something wrong, you aren't necessarily cast out. You're just a member who is behaving badly, who did something unfortunate. But you still need to be defended, because any attack on any individual within the group is an attack on the entire group. Whereas white people do not think that way. And the idea that white people need to start thinking that way is a radical shift, a radical change in how white people operate and have operated for a very long time.
Right. I believe that Evola characterizes this as an honor-based ethos versus a fame-based ethos. So, and Japanese culture definitely shares that as well, where it doesn't, it's seppuku, you are literally supposed to kill yourself, to violate your own person if you violate the law, or if you don't, live up to your warrior code. Now, so Mr. Coolmug says, if your sense, and he's kind of arguing against the honor-based ethos, in the sense that he does want us to go through that transformation that you mentioned that would be fundamentally changing the identity of white people. But he says, if your sense of ultimate good is so beyond temporal concerns that you'll abandon your own family or your own person in every moral circumstance, then you're immoral as far as I'm concerned. So, the samurai committing seppuku is immoral in his eyes, and I don't agree with that. I think that is actually a profoundly moral act, because it puts this very high value on the law. And if you just want to look from a materialistic evolutionary perspective, that law is more critical to the eugenic process of the race and its ultimate survival than you, right? You might have more kids, maybe you have great genes, but if you have a great law, that always weighs far more than you as an individual. So upholding the law and upholding those ideals is ultimately what creates the kind of identity that we want to be. Not, I think, defending the identity. It's like a Chinese finger trap, basically. Like if you struggle so hard to this is kind of like an inversion of the metaphor, but if you struggle so hard to retain that identity, whereas you're trying to escape the finger trap, to struggle so hard to retain it for the sake of, well, I have to be me, then most likely you're going to lose it, because the identity will degenerate. Like you're saying, you're going to have to compromise on your ideals to maintain the identity. And as opposed to affirming the ideals which are essential to your identity and not clinging to the identity for the identity's sake, but rather striving after the ideals for their sake, that ends up releasing you from the finger trap, ends up producing a freer future for your folk. So what if the law, Anders Haas, what if the law is unjust? Well, that's that's the point of like common law. That's the point of all this legal theory and philosophy. We're constantly trying to see if the law is just. So basically, this is I don't see law as being fundamentally distinct from ethics. And we talked earlier about how it's kind of you have this moral burden to pursue full accounting for your ethical prescriptions to really see if the maxim can be universalized. Um, and so, part of the identity of our people is constantly revising our notion of law and constantly questioning the justness of it. Whereas in a society like China, where the axial age ethos was basically preserved, as the folk wisdom until the medieval period in China, you don't see that fundamental reevaluation of the law and justice. Okay, so Mr. Coolmug, I'm not saying it's wrong to sacrifice self or family in certain moral circumstances. I'm saying it's wrong to make that sacrifice in every circumstance. Because sometimes you've got to stand up for yourself and your family and your nation and assert its goodness. Well, I mean, what do you make of that? Because it does seem that there would be this kind of ridiculous extreme of, well, for example, Germany. What Germany is doing now might be seen as a national seppuku. Like they recognize this stain on themselves. It's fundamentally transformed their identity in their own eyes, and so they see to make amends for that, for the law, for justice to be fulfilled, they do have to basically end themselves. So yeah, there is this kind of absurd extreme of the position. How do you avoid that absurd extreme?
I say take it to the next extreme. I say they're not being extreme enough with it. I mean, you can have this Aristotelian idea that there is identity and then there's idealism, and you have to have some kind of balance. Like sometimes we're going to just defend ourselves on a collectivistic basis, right or wrong, my country sort of a thing. And then on the other hand, we need to balance that with like, no, but we also need to have like human rights or something like that. So, but what I'm saying is that the right way, well, this is just my perspective, but I think Germany should view itself not as owning itself. It should view itself as in service to some higher deity, some higher ideal, some universalism, and that its purpose on this earth as a nation is not to serve itself, and it's not even to rectify past wrongs that it did necessarily, to be the arbiter of karma or something like that, but rather it is basically to serve this purpose, this higher purpose of truth seeking or development of culture. Basically, you have to have some kind of higher aesthetic or artistic ideal that you are serving, and you're saying, even though I am flawed as a person, or we are flawed as a nation, we cannot allow that to mar our purpose. Like suicide, I think, on an individual level, is usually wrong for people who have done bad things, because I believe basically in a kind of Christian ethos of, okay, you have done something wrong, and you could commit suicide, but what you should do is you should let go of the pride that is making you want to commit suicide. You have this desire to kind of preserve yourself as innocent, and you feel that committing suicide will undo your sin. So you're kind of taking the scales of justice into your own hands and saying, I am the arbiter of goodness, and I'm going to wipe away this stain. And Christianity kind of says you don't have the right to wipe away that stain. Someone else has the right. That's Jesus has the right to do that. You're not out here to punish yourself for the bad things you've done. You are to make yourself a vessel for God, so the Holy Spirit can come into you, and you can be part of the body of Christ, and you can do His work in this world, regardless of the sins that you've committed. And I think that's how Germany should view itself: is, okay, maybe we've done bad stuff in the past, and you can get into the revisionism about it, but just theoretically, let's say a nation had done bad stuff in its past, I think they should say it is not our responsibility to punish ourselves for that. It's not our responsibility to try to make up for that or remove our own sin by committing national suicide. It is our responsibility to let go of our identity as a nation in some sense and see the nation as subservient to higher ideals. And this is basically how, if you read National Socialist tracts, they talk about how the nation is serving some higher ideal. They talk about how we are just one iteration in this long Aryan tradition, and we've got to carry that forward. We have a responsibility to future generations, and so it's very much forward thinking in that way. And I think that's how you can't just go up to idealistic people and say, hey, you need to stop being idealistic. You need to stop being altruistic. You're being pathological. You need to be more materialistic. You need to be more identitarian. You need to be more self-centered. I think you need to frame it in like, no, you actually need to be more idealistic. You need to stop wallowing in this self-pity and thinking that you are like arrogant enough to be able to wipe away your own sin by hurting yourself. Like, I think that's a very feminine act to say like, oh, I'm a bad person, or like this is the ideology of a teenage girl who's obese. She's like, I'm fat, so I'm going to cut myself in order to like punish myself for my obesity or something. And that's the wrong way to do it. You need to positively work toward a better version of yourself and stop being like the judge and jury where you can like mete out punishments to yourself and be masochistic in order to solve those problems. So yeah, I think nations, they could conceive of themselves in the same way that individuals think of themselves as being like servants to God. You're not in this life to punish yourself for your sins. You're in this life to serve some higher purpose, and that's how I view nationalism in general. As the best way that it would be formulated is we are having a nationalism so that we can come together collectively to serve some higher purpose, not to serve the nation itself, but the nation is mobilized for a higher purpose. Otherwise, yeah, then the whole nationalism, globalism. But what are your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to look at it. And taking the easy way out and thinking that you're taking justice into your own hands by kind of just letting go and letting yourself be destroyed means that you can no longer serve that purpose. And it's ultimately a self-indulgent act. And it's setting a priority on your identity. Like, this stain weighs on me so heavily that I can't bear it anymore, and therefore I'm just going to give up. But obviously that's not forwarding the ideals that put the stain there in the first place. Like, you have to set a higher priority on pursuing good rather than like being so caught up in your own pity or self-pity over your failed identity. So yeah, there are some other points there with when to stand up for yourself. And Mr. Coolmug says, like, if you're not willing to stand up for yourself every now and again when it's right, those virtues won't be expressed. Well, yeah, that's kind of the whole point. The idea is that you don't take justice into your own hands. You do stand up for yourself, and you do protect your identity when it accords with what is just. And so, like, Germany shouldn't allow itself to be destroyed because the principle of justice that it seems to be upholding is a false picture of justice. And so this constant revision and searching after the truth of what is really moral conduct and what is really the good, that is what prevents us from this false sacrifice, this self-indulgent sacrifice, and what keeps us on track towards, if we do ultimately have to do that seppuku, at least we know or are pretty confident that we're doing it in the name of a principle that we would rather have exist than, that we have ourselves exist. It's not an either/or. It's not either I must serve myself or I must serve others. I don't believe in that dichotomy, and I don't believe Germany deserves death and destruction. Right, yeah, like it's not just serving others. It's not just serving yourself. I'm sorry, there's something going on that I have to look at real quick.
Yeah, so I'll carry on with that. It's when you're altruistic, it can, I mean, like, you can just look at in terms of healthy psychology and research of if you are altruistic, you feel good about it, you're healthier, you live longer, you're less depressed or whatever. So, like, you can say, I'm going to the soup kitchen to feed the homeless because it makes me feel good and it helps with my depression or whatever. So you can say I'm helping other people and that is helping myself, and they need not be in contradiction with one another. So I agree with that, and ultimately I see this as you have it's an onion, a sort of an onion of identity from the self, family, nation, and then as wide as possible, humanity, universals, all life itself, or whatever. So those things need not be in contradiction. In fact, they should be in a proper ordering of things. They should be in harmony, where every selfish act, due to the way that ethics is structured within the individual, every selfish act that serves the self also serves the family, also serves the community, the nation, and humanity and life itself. Now, of course, if you don't have the right ethics that doesn't provide those positive and negative reinforcements, then they're going to be in contradiction all the time. So basically, that's the purpose of ethics is to construct some rule that aligns the self up through these different branches to the universal in a way that they are all in harmony and supporting one another and working with one another rather than in contradiction. But often it is the case that people have bad ethics which do not accomplish this task.
Right. So again, these two elements, idealism and identity, depend on each other. And so we're talking about like serving others versus serving the self. So the ideal of altruism versus preserving your own identity. If you don't have the substance of the identity, then the ideal is empty. So literally, you can't help others if you're not like there to help them. You have to at least maintain yourself. So clearly you have to arrive at this balance. Now, Anders Haas says, who should make the law? And the idea is that we all do have a duty to pursue what is true ethical conduct. Otherwise, we run the risk of acting according to a false conception of morality. And that's part of our tradition, going all the way back. We had common law, English common law. We had the Thing system in Germany. And it seems that some level of like representational, consensual agreement upon this like loose ethos is something that Indo-European peoples have been doing for 5,000 years. So we all make the law, but we don't view that. So it's not that we make the law, we all discover the law. And discovering true justice is a philosophical process, is something that we arrive at through discourse, through dialectic with each other, which I always like to just kind of point it back to what we're talking about. What we're doing in talking about it is like making it real, right? Which is a very interesting thing about like questions as to what do we do in the future. Like people really like to talk. We've criticized people on the far right for having this mentality and not being active enough. But in a large degree, this process of sorting things out and dialectic and basically like philosophical dialogue, that is what generates the structure that we seek to implement. So we all make the law, and this process is pursuing the law and pursuing the good. And I do like all these objections. I don't want people to, like, if we respond negatively to someone like the white wolf, I don't typically even address it when you say that we're demiurge worshippers. I'm not even sure what you mean by that. Like, if you could be more specific, then I would get into like a philosophical dialogue with you about the good or bad quality of my highest ideal, which you might think is demiurgic or not. So I kind of do want some clarification on that, actually. It's confusing me. So, but it's exactly this kind of process that I believe in.
Do we want to do a physiognomy of Varg Vikernes, the Thulian perspective?
Yeah, I mean, just him coming to mind already. He's so goofy. He's such a goofy guy, but at the same
I don't
time,
know. Is he that goofy?
I think
I
he's
think
completely
I,
goofy. I like him. I'm
I
not
don't
saying I
know.
don't,
Somehow
but
he has like, despite being a knife murderer or whatever he did, he comes off to me as like this really like fatherly kind of like daddish, just like, hey kids, come listen to me, and I got the wisdom. And he's I don't know. He wears like Santa hat. I just take that as like a bunch of dad jokes. Like I think all his goofiness, he's just like making some dad jokes, putting buckets on his head or whatever. And I don't know. It seems like he really wants to, he wants the system to collapse, and he wants to be one of the few survivors on this planet. And I don't think that's going to happen. But good. I mean, there's always that contingent possibility. So someone's got to do it. Someone's got to go in a woods and prepare for the collapse of everything. So he's the one who's doing it.
yeah. So I'm looking at his face, and I'm sharing it on the screen for people. And I wish there was a clean shaven one that I could look at and get a better idea. Now, one
Well, you
thing
can look
right
at him when he's
away,
younger.
yeah, I'll
I,
look at that. So is this him also? This must be
I'll start looking.
a pretty old picture. But anyway, if that's him, that's interesting. He doesn't have some of the same extremity that I see like in this picture here that I'm sharing, where his eyes are pretty narrow. They're also deep set, which I do believe is like an indication of earnestness, of like truth orientation, of really wanting to know. But like the narrowness of the eyes, it kind of like portrays a myopic kind of mentality to my mind. And then his nose is
Mm-hmm.
kind of, I mean, it's well formed, but in this picture in particular, it kind of looks small, which gives an impression of like, I don't know if it's elfishness. It's
Inwardness?
elfishness. It's like almost naivety, and he is, to my mind, like a naive kind of character. He gets a lot of anthropology stuff wrong, just factually wrong. No one believes that, except for the people that just believe it because Vargas says it. Now he is like he's a handsome person. I don't think he's dumb. I mean, it takes a lot of intelligence to make up the kind of stuff that Varg makes up. But he also, I get the sense that he really believes it. And hey, I've fallen into errors of like sloppy, lazy thinking where I see a few data points and then construct like a hypothesis to explain them that there's probably a simpler hypothesis out there than the one that I've constructed, but it's the first one that comes to mind, and I get this satisfaction from it, and so I'm just content to use it. And I think Varg does that, and then just lets it go. His ears, like people with ears that go out from their head significantly, I tend to think have like a friendlier aspect. He has a relatively high head. I mean, it's not a huge. He just looks like a person of above average intelligence. I don't see genius on that countenance. Um, and his cheeks are a little soft, but he doesn't have like an altogether soft look about him. Like this picture, he looks a little bit harder, but there is this sort of like non-threateningness to this part of his face here, which I think what I'm kind of seeing in that is a lack of competence. So one of the things when I try to analyze physiognomy is the most striking characteristic is like the general intelligence. I do believe that it's possible if you have a high intelligence to basically guess at the intelligence of others, and there are studies that back this up, like having test subjects evaluate or guess at the IQ of a large number of random people, and it's, I mean, well above chance that people are coming back with. And if it's above chance, then there's some acuity going into it. There's some sort of pattern that people are recognizing, and so some people could be better at this than others, just as a proof of concept of that. So that's Varg. And Twit from Uranus is curious why I changed the channel name to Airval. Well, part of it is that I would rather have slightly less visibility. It's not a perfect solution because my name is still in the URL. So, I mean, if someone really wants to find what I'm doing online, if they know me from real life, then they still can. But it's kind of just like, I don't care about trying to hide myself completely and becoming completely anonymous. But a layer of anonymity is better. And Airval is what my last name was, my family name was before immigration to the U.S. Knife murderer. People are talking about Varg, and somebody wants
they
us
want
to
you to do a Sargon.
Yeah, Sargon. That'll be fun. Sargon looks smart. I mean, he does look like an intelligent person.
Problem sometimes with obesity is that I think it hides some of those extreme. Like everyone looks more similar as a baby, everyone looks more similar as an old person, and everyone looks more similar when you're all fat. Like at some point, like obesity is a deracializing feature, basically. Whereas you can like, if someone is fat enough, is it like, are they Asian? Are they white? The distinctions and the features and the skull kind of disappear. So he's not that fat, but I think it'd be interesting to see him with thinner features if he
it's
something
clear
came out of that.
It's clear that he does though have a wide head. It's wider than it is. I mean, it's not literally wider than it is tall, but proportional to the way most people are arranged. Like I have more of a tallish. My head is wider. Like some people have more of a tall, narrow head than I do. Mine's a little bit wider. Sargon, like for the width of his head, the top of his head is not as high as mine is, which according to my kind of system that I keep in mind is like in evidence of a lack of spirituality to some extent, but it's not extreme. It's not that he has this wide short head, and he is idealistic. He has like these higher ideals in mind, but I don't completely trust him because of certain features. Like he doesn't have deep set eyes, and he has the skin above his eye to the top eyelid here like puffs out a little bit, giving the impression of like someone who's how I kind of interpret that is like the eyes that is like the window of the soul basically are kind of like straining out a little bit and really like it's like an acquisitive power seeking kind of trait to my mind. His nose is well formed. Like he looks like the kind of person who would have a good voice and be pretty charismatic. His jaw is wide, evidence of like a good level of testosterone. And then in this picture in particular, like look at that little smirk there, and look at the way, I don't know what it is about his eyes, but there's just something like devious. There's his
eyes look both. He's like lacking the epicanthic folds from what I can see from what you're screen sharing, and so there's like an Asiatic quality to it, but then there's also a feminine quality. Like he almost has like these feminine, like a woman who's like trying to seduce you with that kind of smirk and the slitted eyes where you can't see the direction of the eyes. There's something hidden there. It's like he's looking at you and he knows something that you don't, and he's very happy about that because he's hiding his intentions, but he can see yours clearly.
Yeah.
And that makes him very happy. He also seems to have smaller ears. So perhaps he's listening to others less and himself more. Oh yeah, a picture of him without the beard. I don't know if that's faked or not. I don't, because all of the like before and after the beard shot I've seen look photoshopped, but I'm not sure he actually has as wide and well-formed a jaw as it looks. He just has good facial hair.
He also has this kind of like cherub quality where you'd expect him to be like an attendant to Dionysus or something. Like there's this definite like effete kind of worldly feminine quality for sure.
Like what's the guy with goat feet who's like playing? He's kind of like a Panish figure. He's kind of a guy I would expect to like be running around with goat feet.
Yeah.
Like when you see depictions of Pan, he kind of like has that beard, that little devilish smile, those slitted eyes. He just needs some horns, a big pot belly.
Yeah. I think that's enough on Sargon. All right. So what else is going on? We'll probably wrap up in 15 minutes or so. Have we even read Locke yet? I have. Have you read Locke, Ken?
I haven't read Locke, but I've read Loki.
Oh, okay. Well,
so I don't know. I think I'm one step up. I'm one step ahead of the game. Locke is pleb tier. You're going to got to read Loki.
All right. I think that's why I didn't initially I saw that comment asking for the physiognomy, and I didn't want to get onto it because I knew it would completely derail any more intellectual conversation. But I'm kind of content to leave it there. I think the basic thesis is a good one, that there seems to be a tension between identity and idealism, but they also depend on each other for their mutual fulfillment. But at the same time, you kind of do end up picking one over the other. And to some extent, this seems to characterize like a left-right divide. We didn't really explore that. But yeah, what do you think on that point then, before we kind of wrap up fully? Like, do you think that it seems that idealism is more left and identitarianism is more right?
Well, I think there is an idealistic right that is implicitly white, basically. And this is Sargon, who's like, we need to forget about race and we need to embrace ideals, and all these conservatives who do the same game, which is very, if you look at the alt-right, like you more frequently get I have more non-white viewers of my channel as a percentage of like people who comment and interact with me than probably Sargon has. And so like no one is buying this color blindness thing except white people. And so like in a sense, Sargon is more of a white supremacist than like actual like explicitly pro-white people, which is a weird thing. So in a sense, his idealism is like even more identitarian than the actual identitarians. And then of course you have like the most basic like nationalism versus globalism. Of course, you would think that the nationalist is going to be more identitarian than the globalist who is idealistic. So I think, there's some truth to that, which is why I don't really identify as a nationalist in a philosophical sense of like my political theory. I think it is an extant force that needs to be dealt with in a practical way. And I don't have animus against in-group preference in the same way I don't have animus against people enjoying the food that they eat or whatever kind of basic instinct that you have. But I don't think it's like an axiom upon which to build much of anything in theoretical abstract terms, because it's a particular thing.
It can't be a first principle. Because then you
run into but then there are people who try to make it as a first principle. For example, Talmudic thinking, you say, well, the first principles that we preserve our group and whatever we do to do that, and that's why I'm not a convert to Orthodox Judaism. If I did believe in that, then it would seem like a great system. But if people try to do this on the right, where they say that our first print, like they frame everything in terms of nationalism versus globalism, everything, and that to me is you're pitting everything of identitarianism versus idealism, and kind of Greg Johnson will talk about Heidegger and talk about the particularity of our identity, the particularity of our philosophy and our thought. The context is supreme, and it's almost like there is no higher idealism, and therefore, like, we just have to. And I did a video on this, why Jared Taylor is wrong again, and I kind of used Jared Taylor as just a funny clickbait title, but I could have been talking about Greg Johnson, where I've heard him talk about this and defend this, and he tries to do it in like a philosophically stringent way, and I'm hearing that, and it just doesn't appeal to me, that the idea that everything is the foundation is our identity, and whether, like, because I just don't think that is the white ideal. Like, if someone is a crack dealer or whatever, you don't defend them just because they're white. You kind of cast them out of the white community. And and what white people theoretically want to do is the reciprocal action, which is, if someone is good enough, we want to kind of let them into the white community. Like, oh, he's part of the talented 10th, or he's the exception to the rule, Naxalt. So we want to bring that person in and invite them and be inviting to strangers. That is, so like, anytime there's this inversion that happens when you become too white, you become too white identitarian. Like, if you actually are true to that tradition and that attitude, the nucleus of it, you do end up going back into, it's almost like a self-defeating thing, where you end up going back into the idealism. So I think on an individual level, if you actually look at like, we can see how the right has extreme idealists and extreme identitarians. Within the left, they present themselves as extreme idealists. Leftists pretend that they're, well, yeah, even there it's a contradiction, where obviously identity politics on the left is a huge thing, but they try to present it in this intersectional way of it's all about basically like the underdog versus the overdog, or something like that. We're trying to bring all people together. We're universalistic. So you have like a cosmopolitan left that sees itself above identity and sees identity as like something that should be wiped out so that we can all be equal and egalitarian. And then you have the actual components of the political left that are, we're black, so we vote Democrat, we're Hispanic, so we vote Democrat, we're Jewish, so we vote Democrat, and that kind of identity politics that is actually the mechanism of leftist power. So, there are contradictions on both sides, and I wouldn't be able to say, I mean, from my perspective, I think it's useful to talk about like a right-wing globalism, or a non-nationalist right wing, or something like that, an idealistic right, a non-identitarian right. And of course, when we analyze the left, we see both of these components being in contradiction, but also benefiting one another, working alongside one another. At the end of the day, I try to present the best dichotomy I have that kind of fits into the left-right political spectrum. Is you either say it's like the white wing forces or the anti-white forces, and then the other one is like the hereditarian versus the egalitarian. But as far as idealism and identitarianism, I think on both sides it's too much of a mixed bag to make that correlation. But how do you see it?
Well, yeah, it does seem to be that both elements either like lead to the other, like a myopic focusing on one or the other manifests as an expression of the other. So like classical liberal, libertarianism, complete idealistic turn results in, like in actual history, a white identity movement. I mean, you look at all the libertarians that turned to the alt-right just a few years ago. So, and of course, so many of them are de facto white. Now, there was some philosophical point that I wanted to make. Oh yeah, it's that I think the path forward for like positioning yourself in this antithesis is seeking a common identity to the identity idealism divide. And that to me seems to be that the present is idealistic. The present context is always ideal, it's mental. And every mental act has an aspect of goodness or badness. There's a value aspect to everything in our experience. And every conscious act falls in a moral context. We're always in a moral context and act from a moral place. And so we're like inescapably idealistic. Affirming identity is an idealistic act. But the identity might be seen as the building up over time of a constellation of idealistic acts. And shaping that identity is basically like building a larger mind, building a larger system of thought, a larger system of ideals that coheres with itself, that survives the test of time, that's basically, what the species is about, pursuing immortality to the extent that we can, and pursuing the good to the extent that we can, because the idealism of the moment is subject to the fallibility of the mortal condition. So identity can be a means of escaping that mortal fallibility. We tap into an extrinsic ideal, which is itself an identity. So these aren't really ever absolutely separate, although they do manifest as being antithetically opposed. And this goes firmly hand in hand with the perennial philosophy idea that at the most fundamental level, everything, besides being ultimately one in a sense that we can't actually wrap our minds around, first manifests as this kind of antithesis, strife and love, fire and ice, and that sort of thing. Jacob Natale, or Natalie, can you explain / elaborate on how the present is ideal, please? So I just mean that the present is in your mind. You don't ever directly perceive matter. You don't even have a coherent concept of matter. When I say ideal, I mean the dichotomy between philosophical materialism and philosophical idealism. So in the modern period, Bishop Berkeley, or George Berkeley, I think is his actual first name, is someone who introduces this position. And he makes good arguments. Immanuel Kant forwards this in a number of ways. Schopenhauer, Schelling, the German idealists, and Husserl ultimately in the early phenomenological school results in some form of idealism. And also now in contemporary physics, informational reductionism, where space, time, and matter are seen as emergent, and information is actually fundamental. That's more and more common. It's becoming a more popular position. But I don't just mean it in the strict philosophical sense. I also mean it in the ethical sense, in that the present is inescapably value laden. It always has its idealistic, in the more like colloquial definition, it always has its idealistic sense. Just no action is without a purpose. No action is without a motive. And so it's always setting up a value hierarchy. But I think we've gone on long enough. Did you have any concluding thoughts, or?
No, I think that's good for today.
All right. So I don't know about Tuesday. I see that YouTube added some sort of new feature, and I'm trying to figure out how to send out a message through the subscriptions. But if you join the Discord, I'll go ahead and post in there what the deal for next week is going to be, because I think we have some scheduling issues to work through. But anyway, thanks guys for tuning in, and talk to you next time.
Bye-bye.